This is Jay McCarthy from Prime Vault with another of our architecture series. This one will talk about the fundamental trade-off between security and usability. Now, by security, of course, we mean the integrity of our data, the integrity and privacy that we want it to have, and a large set of other properties that we'd like to hold for our access to that data. And by usability, we mean convenience, simplicity, and ease of use. These are both nebulous terms. I'm using security and usability with their normal English meanings, as opposed to any precise technical meaning. Now, there's a straightforward example of the trade-off between security and usability that's familiar to most users of cryptocurrencies, and that is the private key. So, for example, one way to deal with the private key is to, for example, have the private key stored on a piece of paper in a safety deposit box. The safety deposit box is protected by some really reliable, scary men with guns in a big building with lots of keys and whatnot. And anytime you want to use your cryptographic wallet, what you do is you take the transaction that you want to form and you write down on a piece of paper the bytes for that transaction, which of course you computed yourself because you don't want to trust some software. Then you take this and you go down to the safety deposit box, and in the secure room, you take out the key. And then you run the encryption algorithm by hand on a piece of paper using the key, which is only on that piece of paper, and you don't have it written anywhere else. And then you write down the signed bytes of the signed transaction, and then you leave and you go type them into your computer and you submit them. This is a perfect air gap system where there is no way for a hacker to intervene in the process and get a hold of your key. There's no way for someone to do a supply chain attack on the software that's preparing the transaction because you're preparing the transaction yourself directly by actually writing down the bytes. And you're actually running the algorithm yourself, so there's no risk that anyone could attack some program that anyone can change. Now, clearly, this is an absurd way to actually use a cryptographic wallet, but it may be a wise way to use it if, for example, that cryptographic wallet were in control of billions of dollars, or if this was like the cryptographic key that unlocked and authorized the nuclear weapons for your sovereign country. When you have extreme examples of value and extreme examples of threat, then that justifies extreme approaches to security, which often results in far less usability. This by hand way of interacting with the key is clearly not the way that our children are going to interact with cryptocurrency when cryptocurrency is mainstream. There's no way that my little sister is going to use cryptocurrency instead of Venmo if this is the way that she has to deal with it. So instead, you can imagine something that's far more flexible. For example, how about I just run a company like PayPal or Venmo or a traditional bank like Chase, except that instead of dollars, we just have USDC or Bitcoin in it. And whenever you want something to happen, you just tell me and I'll do it for you. And maybe you tell me by using a snazzy app that's very convenient, or you just swipe a few keys to get into it. And behind the scenes, of course, we're using cryptography, we're using cryptocurrency. This is never actually shown to the user in a meaningful way. A model like this is, of course, far more usable. And one of the reasons we know that it's more usable is because it's the way that almost all centralized currencies and centralized banking products work right now. But if you're a crypto purist who's been in the world a long time, then you know all the traditional arguments against fiat currencies and against non-cryptocurrency solutions like this. How do we know that the funds are really there? How do they know it's really me? All of these issues are present in this situation, even though cryptocurrency is being used. So this demonstrates that cryptocurrency by itself does not produce security or any particular security guarantees. It's merely the way that this app works behind the scenes. And so, along the spectrum of security and usability, between the most inconvenient thing we can imagine and the most convenient thing we can imagine, there's just a huge design space. And that design space, that spectrum, is really what a policy is managing. For example, because the policy language allows you to express usable situations and more restrictive situations. So, for example, one thing that a policy could do is it could say, Jay can do whatever he wants. That is a very, very flexible policy. But another thing that a policy might say is that Jay can spend money from the main Ethereum wallet, but he can only spend $10 per transaction. And in a given week period, his expenses can never go more than $100. And maybe there's a different allowance for my monthly spending. In addition to this, maybe I can only interact with particular smart contracts. I can call Uniswap, but not Crazy Chris's online casino. And I can only interact with certain wallet addresses. So all of these restrictions, what they do is they make it slightly less usable because they make it so that there may be things that I want to do, but I can't do because it goes against the policy. And in these situations where I want to go outside of the bounds of the policy itself can comment on it. For example, the policy itself may say that, well, in a situation like that, automatically create an approval transaction, an approval request where Jay's boss gets asked, can Jay do this thing? Or maybe the policy says that it will automatically not be approved. And so, what policies can do is they can allow us to express in a programmatic and technical way the constraints that we want to apply. And if the policy itself is secure, then now what we've done is we've made it so that we have a secure environment where we can talk about the trade-offs between usability and security that we want in our particular application. And we don't have to do it for a universal solution for all users of Prime Vault. Every Prime Vault customer can decide for themselves where they want to sit in this continuum, even on a per user and per vault basis. Now, furthermore, some tools that cryptocurrency offers and cryptography in general offers to get around this usability problem come down to things like how do we authorize and how do we know that a request really came from Jay, for example? Well, one way to do that is to have something that's extremely permissive, which is to say, I'm Jay, then the message came from Jay. That's very usable because it's very easy to say, I'm Jay. But it's also clearly insecure because other people can say that they're Jay too. Now, one thing that's slightly less usable and slightly more secure would be if there's some centralized service that I authenticate to, say with a username and password. And when I authenticate to it, that thing is trusted to say I'm relaying a message from Jay. That is essentially how things like centralized exchanges work. They're empowered to claim to act on behalf of a user without actually having to prove that the user request really comes from the user. And this is more usable than the user having to manually create transactions themselves, but it's also more secure because there's at least some check that's being made to ensure it really came from the user. But we can go further along that spectrum. For example, we can imagine a centralized server, and what it does is it prepares transactions, and that's trusted, so it's a trade-off. But when it prepares these transactions, what it does is delivers them to an end user device for signing, where the end user device is assumed to be safe and in the user's possession. And all requests that get made have to ultimately be signed actually by the user as opposed to produced by something the user authenticated with. This is another point in the security usability spectrum. One of the things one of the main things that Prime Vault provides is in addition to this expressive policy language I talked about before, for talking about the particular ways your organization wants to trade off in security, we've also designed what we think is the sweet spot between security and usability when it comes to each kind of important interaction that a user has with their vault. Most transactions are going to happen through the mechanism of Prime Vault preparing something and it being signed by the user. But it's possible to have certain kinds of transactions that are essentially pre-authorized. One kind of high level way to think about this is to imagine that you prepared beforehand a spreadsheet that has all the transactions that you're going to do this month. And you sign that spreadsheet one time. And once you sign that list of transactions, each transaction has a date on which it can happen. Now, what Prime Vault does is maybe you just trust Prime Vault to report the time to the vault. So when it reports the time, the vault can run the corresponding transaction. And so now you have the usability of not having to sign for every single transaction because you already signed for them all at once when you submitted the spreadsheet. That's a really simple way to think about the kinds of automation that are possible with Prime Vault. But of course, we'll talk more about automation in a later architecture talk. Thank you very much for your attention for this one, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much.